good afternoon. I guess good to see you that you skip some of the lunch to be here with us for this exciting session that we have on the making the future economy work, how to move ahead of the automation of artificial intelligence curve. That's quite a topic, and we have very wonderful and excellent speakers to join us. So I'd like to ask them to come to the stage. Jessica Berlin, Managing Director of CoStruct Germany, please come in. Kenneth Lawson, Executive Director of Florida Department of Economic Opportunity in the United States. Great to see you. A long trip to Poland, to Warsaw, yes. And Paweł Surówka, the CEO of the largest insurance group in Poland. So what we'll be talking about is pretty much trying to recognize all the challenges of technological progress, some impact of economy, both macro and micro, and maybe some insurance issues, why not? The human dimension of this new, what you call today, fourth industrial revolution. So I am Paweł Wojciechowski. I'm Chief Economist of Social Insurance Institution, but at the same time, I associate myself as a Senior Fellow of Pulaski Foundation. So let me start with the questions. First on the macro level, to Jessica here. How would you look at this fourth industrial revolution from the point of view of winners and losers in the world? Who's really losing, who is winning? Is it chance, opportunity?
Thanks for that. So it's funny that you open with this question of winners and losers, opportunities and challenges, because I think that framing is actually part of the problem in how we address the fourth industrial revolution and automation. It's not a question of whether it's a challenge or an opportunity, it's simply a reality. You know, this is the new technology paradigm that is going to shape our economies and our societies. And so instead of kind of wringing our hands and worrying if it's going to be good or bad for us, we have to recognize that this is what is coming. In many cases, it's already here, and we have to ask ourselves, how do we adapt to maximize the benefit and minimize any potential negative impacts? And you know, the topic is so broad, and the numbers of technologies involved are so broad, so I'm not going to focus in on a specific technology or sector. We can get into that more in the discussion. But I would say broadly there's two major dimensions that we should be keeping in mind, whether we're policymakers, whether we're business people, whether we're defense or in other sectors. And one very, very dangerous challenge is bias. Right now, you know, across the world, there's increasing amount of awareness around the kind of subconscious bias in human decision makers that leads to to terrible human costs, whether it's police violence, whether it's drone strikes. You know, there's a human cost to bias and to human operators of defense and security systems making a rash judgment based on subconscious bias. And the real danger is if we are creating technology systems and they're being created by humans who also carry the subconscious bias, we will be designing algorithms and technology systems that have bias literally built into their infrastructure and into their algorithms. And so we have to be really conscious of this and make sure that we are constantly revisiting our technologies and the teams who are building them to make sure that we are not programming our technologies to inflict automated violence in or discrimination in communities. And the second point is on economic inclusion. Of course, with the rapid expansion of automation technologies in manufacturing and other sectors, we have a huge economic opportunity. But also this will come at the cost of jobs in the near term. And we can take the old example of, oh well, lots of horse carriage drivers lost their jobs when cars hit the roads, and that's true. So we know how to go through these transitions. It's not a new problem or a new dynamic, but we have to be very very proactive and engaged in how we manage it, because the scale of it, the sheer scale and speed of this transition will be unlike anything the world has ever seen. And so my last point will be in terms of how do we mitigate that, and actually on both points, I think it's a common point: education. Whether it's in combating bias or whether it's in ensuring economic inclusion and helping people transition in the new economy, we need to fundamentally restructure how we train people to work and think in this new economy.
You've mentioned the elements of which alludes to this the concept of technological unemployment was brought by Keynes, with the two effects, which is the productivity growth. At the same time, some of the jobs will be lost. So there might be a potential disruption of the labor markets, and also maybe a polarization, because the high skills would get jobs and low skills would lose the jobs. This is the general understanding, and this is the question now. I want to ask the question, Ken, on this polarization of the labor market, and what the state of Florida or the other institutions could do to upskill, and you talk about education, to get up this ladder to get people right where they could be in the marketplace.
That's an important question. I'm from the United States. The state of Florida is the boot of the United States. And there I'm in charge of developing our economic policy for my state and looking at workforce development. And whether it's global or national or in a local level, we recognize that technology is here. It's coming. And it has displaced people. It's scared people. But realize that we have to ensure that we have policies in place that ensure that human beings can earn a wage, build a home, have a family. And in my state, we're taking this issue head on. In my department, this next Monday, we're holding a meeting called the Talent Development Council. Our leader, the governor, has decided to ensure that we're looking at the future. How do we make sure we train our people for future jobs? Make sure we train those who are here now to understand the future trends. We have a combination of academia, business, and government coming together to develop a strategy that's long-term. So with our Talent Development Council, where I'm the vice chair, we're ensuring that we're drilling down and having those conversations. Because if we look at our education system, at times, it's behind technology. And if we're failing to look at different modes of education, whether it's university or trade, we have to ensure that individuals understand the coming trends and prepare them. In addition to having a conversation and developing a strategy, there must be a financial investment in technology and technology training. In my state, my governor has put several $1 million into financial technology companies and training. We have a combination of agencies looking at how we bring that sector to Florida, but make sure our people understand these are the skills you need. This is what you need to get to work, and also prepare, be flexible mentally. Because the technologies of tomorrow haven't been created yet. And if we train our people simply to have the jobs for today, they won't be flexible in the next 20, 30, or 40 years for those future jobs. But it comes back to the humanity of all of it. Are we training people in a humane way? Or developing policies that make sense, but creating a landscape for future businesses in the technology sector to grow, decreasing regulation, but at the same time, increasing knowledge and opportunity?
Thank you. Now, after having this macro and micro perspective, I want to move to the corporate. Micro, the corporate, which is the largest insurance company in Poland, but actually in Central and Eastern Europe. It's a really huge conglomerate of different companies. And of course, you look probably at the AI and issues from the perspective of both the employer that is putting some applications using the technology in your corporation, but at the same time looking at some issues where people meet with liabilities, which result from some risks. For example, from risk of working of humans with robots, or maybe risks associated with some use of robots or AI applications that would that you don't know who should be liable for by all the risks that can happen. Automated vehicles is one example. Could you comment how you look at this fourth industrial revolution from your perspective?
Yeah, that's obviously a vast field, and thank you very much for the question. Now, just to pick up on it, I was very much intrigued by the title of this panel, because the title was "How to Move Ahead of the AI Curve." Now, you could theoretically, particularly here in Poland, say, how to go together with the trend, but you asked the question how to get ahead of it, which I believe is the right way to ask the question, but obviously that is much more challenging, and this is a little bit the kind of mindset that we have adopted. So obviously when you evoke artificial intelligence and big data and machine learning in the insurance space, as you pointed out yourself, you open a whole bunch of very significant underlying questions that touch on the very nature of our business. And the nature of our business, and you're in insurance yourself, is to a certain way to predict risk, to predict and price risk accurately. And for the centuries that we've been around as insurance companies, the idea was mostly to pool risks, to create pools of risks where we would pretty much control on a big number of singular points. We would be able, in the theory of big numbers, to say with a good probability what will be the number of occasions that an individual risk will occur in a cohort of a bigger pool. Now, as we get smarter and smarter, and machines get better and better in learning from data, and as you as an individual person create more and more data, and your online track becomes even more readable, what you post online, what you consume, how you pay, it actually comes down to the fact that you start to become your own pool, and this is a little bit the challenge that we have as a societal issue, is that insurance companies, like others, will become better and better in analyzing and quantifying your own personal risk, which obviously opens absolutely the question of bias, which means we will be very good at selling insurance to people who don't need it, and we will be very good at pricing out people who would actually need the insurance. And obviously we don't want to do that. So the question is how to move ahead. And the ahead part, and this is a little bit where we as a company try to think in this direction, is that the good news about it is that as a company will get better and better, as insurance companies will get better and better at analyzing your own risks, they can actually be better and better in helping you mitigate the risks that you have to deal with. And obviously health is a very good example of that. So yes, an insurance company could be very good at predicting that you have a particular disposition of, having this and this condition, and therefore could, for example, not want to sell you a particular product which would give you cover against this. However, if you change that business model into an insurance company is not there for selling your product in the case that you have a risk, but if you change the business model of the insurer to say, we're here to help you to prevent that risk and to control the risk, to manage the risk, and to live with it, then all of a sudden AI and big data and all those advances that we have in technology work for you and not against you. But again, necessarily, you need to change the business model, which is pretty much exactly what we try to do at PZU. And if I may, some little bit advertisement, that is pretty much the reason why, for example, we framed our new healthcare program to say 10 years longer, right? In terms of what we want to do is set a goal for our clients where we say, actually, our goal is not to sell you an insurance product. Our goal is to make you live longer and healthier. And let's see how we can find solutions that help you achieve that goal. So again, there are threats. if we don't address them, and I think if legislators, if governments don't address them, there is an enormous risk for bias and inequality. However, if you change the business model and if you embrace those technologies, it's something that can actually help you. Then there's quite a lot of good opportunity that it will help us advance the curve.
So I understand that you're looking very much ahead, and I understand this concept of platform, for example, the sharing platform, and on-demand economy development, and changes of the human behavior and demand for that. You try to first understand and try to see how to adjust your business model, how to adjust your model structure to price the risk. But let me ask you a more specific question because I spoke with a person who deals with drones and the aviation sector and this big event, actually the US, I will not mention the company, but the acronym MAX, if you remember the MAX, it was a plane that the second incident happened, and how can you in the chain of development from the invention, for example, of AI and robotics, okay, to the level that people train the robot, to the person that use the simulation, okay, of such a plane, to the moment that a pilot is acting or not acting properly. How you kind of figure out how to adjust your pricing of risk? How you can manage this from this perspective? It's quite complex. This chain of development. And of course, something happened like that. And the question is, who's responsible? Who should we sue? Okay, in that case, or how to insure such accident with, for example, automated vehicles?
Well, wow, that is really a whole area of questions that make your mind flip. But in a certain way, as always, you have the innovation first, and then you have the regulation that comes with it and sets the standards. I was recently in a conference where somebody said, we are a little bit in the seatbelt phase of the evolution. Like first came the cars, and then there was there was a time in the 40s and the 50s where, mortal accidents in the US and car accidents were just like through the roof. And all of a sudden people said, well, we need to do something, and then here came the seatbelt. So we're a little bit in the seatbelt phase where people started to seeing the Googles, the Facebooks, and all of a sudden we start to realize they're all not here to make the world a better place. Yeah. They're also here to earn some money, and let's think about putting some regulation around it. And obviously we need to set some standards, and a lot of it is about definition. Like you mentioned one example which was linked to aviation. Let me give you two others that I found very interesting. One linked directly into insurance, the other one less so. I was recently talking to the CEO of a big American bank. I maybe shouldn't give the name, but he said, the problem, for example, about the fact that the banks have all become technology companies rather than financial companies, like most of the trades that were used to be done by, those kind of Wall Street traders that we all know from the movies, today they are done by algorithms. Now, the big problem about algorithms is you can read them. So in the old days where you would have a rogue trader who was playing the market and trying to do something not very ethical, then you would need to ask the trader, why did you do that? And he can come up with a whole bunch of explanations. Today, you look at the algorithm and you'll see, so what was actually your intention when you were doing this? So to a certain extent, you're absolutely right. You have to program some consequences from the start. And you have to ask yourself the question from the very beginning. Now, let's put this in a case that is very interesting for us in insurance, which is obviously automotive, or which is mobility and which is autonomous driving. And the entire question of when we come in the reality of smart cities and autonomous cars, then it's not only the question of who is going to insure them. Obviously, most reports that we see foresee that the entire car motor insurance market will go down by pretty much half, because people will stop owning cars, people will just buy mobility, and the entire insurance will go on the platform of the operator. But then obviously the big question is, who is in charge of the risk? Is it the company who runs the car? Is it the operator who oversees the network? Is it the company who wrote the software? I think the answer is we don't know yet. We have to see the standards. But it is definitely a very interesting time. And yes, to my point again, it changes the business model in a quite fundamental way, because you cannot wait for some instances to happen to judge them. You have to actually foresee some consequences and make your ethical judgments before that.
Since you mentioned ethical issues, I mean, could we say that we should, with AI, algorithms, is ethical to teach machines, okay, let's say robots with AI, ethics, to make choices, for autonomous vehicles? Is it a plausible idea, to use ethical approach to machines, okay, to robots, because they will have to make choices sometimes, drive left or right, who's going to be killed. I'm sorry to say, maybe dramatic incidents happen, but if you say that the stress test, this dramatic coincidence that happened, with autonomous vehicles, these questions came up. And how when you deal with your labor issues and training in Florida,
yes,
how do you address those type of issues?
I think the building what he had said earlier, if we're going to create rules and ensure there's a lack of bias, we have to make sure that people understand the technology and the purpose. And then if we're dealing with governments who are setting regulations to help guide businesses and also individuals, we have to have a further education of those leaders, because so many leaders are behind what's happening in the business sector or in technology sector. And then when we look at the balance between protecting our people and then having regulations to promote growth, it calls for government to understand more fully, how does this technology help our people? How do we help this sector grow in the state or the country or in the region? And then regarding ethics, that comes down to, what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to accomplish having this machine simply move one piece of paper to another side of the room? Or are we talking about someone being in a car and able to sleep while the car is driving itself? Then how make sure we have logical programs put in and make decision making, but yet have some oversight where the machine doesn't completely take over. And not be, flip, but if you look at the Terminator movies, do we want Skynet? Or do you want to make sure we have a washing machine we turn on or off? All right, and knows what programs to go through.
And I think that's a crucial point, and it boils down to a very fundamental question. Do we use these technologies, do companies get to use these technologies to maximize profit or to improve service delivery? And that right now is, as you said, it's open season because the governments are totally behind in regulating this space. And to your example you gave before, which sounded like a wonderful marketing slogan, we're an insurance company, we're here to make sure you live a long life and are healthy. But actually, no, an insurance company, and I don't mean it personally, but for your company, but just in general in the industry, it's the job to sell insurance at the highest price, at the lowest risk, and at the lowest exposure. That's the duty of every company to their shareholders. And so if you're saying, or if we say that the goal of the company should be to deliver the service in a way that is equitable and efficient, especially if it's a kind of service that affects people's well-being and society as a whole. But even take a Facebook. If you would ask them what's their purpose, it's to connect people, keep people in touch. No, it's not. It's to maximize the amount of time you, the user, spend looking at ads. That is the goal of that platform. That is its current function. It didn't start out that way, but that's now what its job is, what Facebook's job is to its shareholders. So with these technologies, we need to recognize, like, what are they being used for right now? And if it's being used to make sure you're clicking more and to understand your use patterns in a given app or on a given platform, or in the case of the insurance world, to see what's the best kind of insurance they can sell you at the lowest risk, and all these kinds of issues. And that's where, on the regulatory side, we have to be more active. I say this with a great deal of skepticism, frankly, as to whether or not that will happen, because as you rightly pointed out, they barely understand how these technologies operate. I mean, even recently when Zuckerberg was testifying to the Senate, and one of the senators literally didn't even understand how Facebook's revenue model works. We laughed. It was a joke across the internet, but it belies an ignorance that is extremely worrying. And things will probably get a lot worse before they get better. We will react after a series of crises hit, as if the ones that already have were not enough. But this is the space where we as policymakers or business people need to decide what do we want these technologies to do? What should be their purpose? Do we want the technologies to be using the user, or should they be there to deliver services to the user?
If I can say just one word on that, because you said it's important to know what is the goal of that. The question is, can you, and we are falling behind with regulations, but can you regulate what is the intention of the corporations to develop and use those technologies? And of course, there's another question between corporates and the states, because there's a question of, for example, you mentioned Facebook, but others as well, yes. The issue of what you call a big brother effect. Sure. Who is watching whom? Who is, and for what purpose is doing that? Sure. The espionage, and now you're moving to the abuse of maybe non-state actors, and even because we are the security conference, of this type of elements which are very difficult to regulate. And when you move from typical security issues to terrorism, cybercrime right. issues, then we have even more questions. And what is your view on that?
So, I kind of feel compelled to react. No, I just wanted to.
As said, nothing personal against the insurance
industry.
No. Just in general.
I did say, no, obviously it's a good marketing slogan. I do agree with that. But the other part is that, I did mention there's a need of change in business model. And actually, and this change is necessary. And I'm very happy that you mentioned education. Because I think that the part where education is needed is not only on the level of the governments and the regulators, it's also needed on the level of the individual consumers. And it's happening. And it's happening, but it's not happening enough, in the sense that consumers need to understand that data is a currency. And I believe, and to your point, I think that a deal where a company says, I'm going to do something for you, and you come to me and you take advantage of my service, and in the process I collect a whole bunch of data that you didn't even know that I would own, and then I sell them to the others without your knowledge, is a completely different one than a company that says, so I'm going to take your data, I'm going to analyze it together with you, and I'm going to share whatever comes out of it and work with you in order to, have an outcome that is desired by you. So I think that the empowerment that you were speaking about starts with the fact that consumers become aware of the fact that they are owners of their data, that there is a certain element, like, they pay and they entrust their data to companies for a specific purpose, then they withdraw the data once, the service is done. And this is pretty much, the kind of model that I would wish for, or I see for the insurance business, where on the one hand, I believe insurers can be a great, I would say, vault for data, because at some point you as a consumer have to ask yourself, where do you keep your data? And for the time being, the people who keep your data are search engines and social networks. The question is it the most trustworthy places to keep your data? Now, in most of the countries, people would probably say the safest way to keep your data would be the state. Now, I'm not sure that in every country, every citizen would necessarily say that that's the best idea.
Right.
So I do see a certain, area for example, insurance companies or financial companies that today are here to storage your wealth, to, for example, be the storage of your data and help you manage and pay in a certain way with your data, the way that you pay with any kind of currency. And then, particularly in the insurance place, I do see the new role for insurance and to say, we are here, our job is to foresee risk, so let us be your risk mitigator when it comes down to your personal risk, to your health risk, to your well-being. But it also comes down to corporations where, for example, we talk to big industrial groups and we say, and this is pretty much happening, we are here to mitigate any risk that you don't want to take on you in a business way. So if your business is oil digging for oil, then we take off risks that you don't want to deal with, like, for example, being attacked by cyber or something like that. So this is how I see the insurance way evolve. And again, I absolutely subscribe to the view that it only can happen if there's a real empowerment of the consumer, whereas he or she knows what the data is used for and willingly agrees for that. That's absolutely true. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that is well. But there's some thoughts about I've heard some futurists saying that you can be born and immediately you could sell maybe the future to any company everything about your own behavior to company for the whole life. And that question is whether that could create any type of abuses, and as you mentioned, before something happens, the states are not moving with regulations, and this is a fuzzy world where the responsibilities are shared, and even from the risk perspective, the consciousness of risk of the consumer may be an important one, but figure it out. Today, the more complex world is increasingly difficult. Yes, Jessica.
Yeah, and this gets back to the earlier point about getting ahead of the curve and what does that actually mean. The private sector right now has an opportunity to get ahead of the regulatory curve on this. And it's one of those things where it's a backwards logic, where the private sector will actually be in a position of advantage if it self-regulates now. And already looks ahead at these risks, because you guys will understand better than the government right now what are the risks and what are the best mitigation strategies. Because if the private sector is able to do that, and then the regulatory systems, when it comes down, it will be much less of a shock. It's instead of getting stopped in your tracks by government limitations on how algorithms target young people, for example, or how your services are being targeted to lower income consumers or what have you, you will be better positioned to adapt. And so it can actually be in the self-interest to say, okay, we know these are the problems coming. We're going to take a long-term strategy to maximize our growth and mitigate our risk of exposure to basically getting the wall come down on us when the government wakes up. That might sound a bit optimistic, because I think for most companies in the short term, they will simply be looking to maximize their commercial growth, come what may. And hope to ride it out as long as possible. But a private sector company that believes in its product as not only a vehicle for growth and revenue, but also as a critical service provision, I think this would be the way to truly get ahead of the curve.
And also, too, I think, adding to what you said, government can be slow at times, but also can be quick, as long as it partners with the private sector and have conversations about the product, the future view, and how we protect people and also ensure business growth. In my state, our governors have created a chief resiliency officer to look at future trends, how we protect the state from, say, job depletion in certain areas, environmental issues, but engaging the private sector on the front end. After the terrorist attacks in 9/11, I was in the Treasury Department, and then we looked at issues involving terrorist financing and anti-money laundering. Before we created the regs for that industry to create more transparency, we engaged the banking and financial system to ask what vulnerabilities exist, what regulations would make sense, what can we do to ensure that we're looking for those that are perhaps bad actors and ensure that the good players are able to engage. The regs we created were not perfect, but we began that process of ensuring there's dialogue. Without that dialogue from businesses, government, and individuals, we'll fail as a system.
Yeah, it's like the way you talk about it looks like all the issues are everywhere the same. In Europe,
They are.
we discuss the same issues, everywhere. So it looks like maybe there's, because we had the international conference, would be discussion about some of the global solutions. As usually people say, well, one thing you can help with education. Okay, that's one thing. Sometimes it's like one of the concepts. The second one, of course, is the concept of how you make the policies agreed on the more global level, because the issue here is a question of a potential fracturing or fragmentation, for example, the internet space, which is already happening. And now, before we close, because we'll be closing in the last 10 minutes, next 10 minutes, I'd like you to comment on this. What can we do on the international level? What are the challenges? How we can approach that? Because there's, the World Economic Forum in Davos, well, we can discuss it. It's fourth industrial revolution was brought from Davos, was named by Mr. Schwab, so, okay. But how we go about it? Where is the places we can discuss those issues? How we can proceed? What are the places in international organization? Who should take the lead? G20 or other places? Is it more a security focus or more of a corporation? Transnational corporation should deal with that, together with the government. Where is the place we can kind of grasp this whole thing? So last comments for a couple of minutes from each of you. Something positive.
So you gave the hugest question for the shortest time.
And 10 minutes.
All right, solve that in 2 minutes. So it really depends on in which sector, right? If you're talking about security, so I think maybe that could be the most near-term critical. We must probably through the United Nations, through Geneva, introduce international laws and standards around the use of digital technologies in warfare. Just as after World War I and World War II, we had to evolve standards and international conventions around the use of chemical and nuclear weapons. And we're not there yet, but we need to get there soon. And if we're talking about trade, oh God help us. I mean, even at the national levels, we don't know what we're doing. At the continental, at the EU level, we don't know what we're doing. So I don't, in the near term, see a viable place for action on the global level. But yeah, you mentioned WEF. There's a lot of talk happening there, and the talk trickles down into the national level decision making. And it just kind of makes people aware of what they didn't know or what they should be talking about. I also don't see global action and standards being introduced because, I mean, we've got the US, we've got China, we've got Europe, there's such different, completely fundamentally different interests and opinions on what data should or should not be used for that I don't see any consensus happening on that side. But for security and for warfare, I think we must.
If we're talking about, ensuring best practices are being shared across the spectrum, and also the future of our workers, a place like this is where we start. We're sharing, our ideals and thoughts. I've shared with you in Florida, we're beginning a group called the Talent Development Council, where I'm bringing businesses, universities, and government together to develop a strategy. But this conversation is not just in the capital of Florida, but throughout the United States. This is happening. We have NGOs and other groups fascinated by what can we do to ensure that conversation takes place on a regional, national level, but share those best practices internationally. Because our economies are not singular. It's not just the US or Florida by itself. It's all of us together, connected. And the person who loses a job in Berlin is similar to the person who loses a job in Tallahassee, Florida, to automation. And I think about, as we grow these new technologies, new sectors, ensure that folks can make money. At the same time, let's protect our people. Ensure that education that comes through our universities, trade schools, or through apprenticeships really are relevant to today's world and the workforce of the future. So again, to answer your question directly, it starts here.
Yeah, I can only say that the problem is huge, and I think it's really difficult to come up with a blueprint today. I mean, one of the examples being the European Union has been, for the time being, at the forefront in consumer protection with the GDPR rules, and also, for example, dealing with platform effects and then finding the Googles, etc., and setting the standards on a global level for the time being. And obviously that could be said as a good involvement, but there are already a number of companies saying that actually the European Union, by doing this, is crippling the possibility of European companies to innovate, because obviously we all have to deal with much heavier load of regulation and can do much less with data than companies in other countries. Let's say it like this. And obviously they have the possibility to work on much better algorithms and much better solutions that at the same time create a certain competitive advantage. So yes, some kind of international harmonization around, for example, data protection would be laudable, because it will actually also set a fairer competing ground for innovation. The other area where we would absolutely need some kind of global network is an area that we and I personally am very interested in. It's cyber, and for example, up to this date, and that's something that is important for insurance companies, there is no international body that would be able to establish attribution of cyber attacks, which is a problem because a lot of insurers have recently, for example, used war exclusion clauses to not pay off insurance policies by saying, this was an act of war. This was probably one of the countries, the usual suspects when you're speaking of a cyber attack. The only problem, it's a completely unilateral call. There is no upper state body that would say, yes, we consider that this was an attack by a state-sponsored entity and it was X, Y, Z. And probably this is also something that would need to come into being if we are speaking about actual international harmonization.
Just saying is probably the worst that could happen is you lose control of what you want to achieve, and of course that comes from some of the global solutions in different international fora, networks, whatever. But the key element of that is, like Jessica and Ken said at the beginning, the issue for us is always to how we're going to be trying to feel that we are ahead of the curve, because there's nothing can stop AI and robotics and industrial revolution, but we have to be very innovative between corporate, between federal states, state governments, international organizations, how to grasp the subject. I really very much appreciate this panel. It was much more than I expected, because I thought we kind of close down on the very little detail kind of conversation, but it was actually excellent to hear you, to have such a wonderful broad and world perspective on really issues that we're touching. So I very much would like to appreciate and thank very much Jessica Berlin, the managing director from CoStruct Germany. Executive Director of Florida Department of Economic Opportunity from the United States. And last but not least, Mr. Paweł Surówka, CEO of PZU Group in Poland. Thank you very much. And thank you as well, Paweł Wojciechowski, and we are just